Hi, I'm Hal Lindsey, and this time I'm coming as your watchman on the wall. I believe that things are happening so fast in pulling together the world powers, the spheres of power that the Bible predicts will rise just before the final 7 years called the Tribulation that ends with the return of Christ to the earth. Things are happening to fit into that so rapidly. I think it's important to review this. For some, it'll be original, but for others, it'll be a review, but a very important one. Now, Daniel is the one who originated the great prophetic long-term panoply of views of continuous world powers. As a matter of fact, beginning with Daniel chapter 2, Daniel got a revelation of the world Gentile powers that would rise to world dominance from his time all the way to the second coming of Christ. So that covers an enormous bit of history. He received a vision of a great statue. There are 4 different metals that were in this statue, and each one is identified as a world kingdom that would succeed the previous one. There are 4 successive kingdoms that would rise. Then in Daniel chapter 7, he got a further revelation about that same subject of the rise of Gentile world kingdoms. And this time they're in the form of a composite beast. Each one of them is a different one, but a composition of different wild animals that would make up the characteristic of that kingdom. And when he goes through 4 of those kingdoms, he brings out very clearly that the first kingdom would be Babylon, and then we learn from identification in Daniel chapter 8, the second kingdom would be the Medo-Persian Empire that would conquer Babylon. The third kingdom would be the Greek-Macedonian Empire headed by Alexander the Great. And the fourth one that was succeeded, the only other great Gentile power that would rise up until the coming of Christ, would be the Roman. The Roman took over what was left of Alexander the Great's conquest and extended it. Now, he describes these 4 beasts in the first part of chapter 7 of Daniel. Then the interpreting angel begins to explain more elaborately to Daniel what these symbols represent. He says, "These great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise from the earth." Now, the word in the original Hebrew for king also means kingdom. You have to determine by the context which it means. Sometimes it means both. I think in this case, it means both. A king would rise and his kingdom with him. So these are 4 kingdoms that would arise from the earth. He goes on to say, "But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Then I," Daniel speaking, "then I desired to know the exact meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with iron teeth and its claws of bronze, and which devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns." This last beast it's a terrible sight, I'm sure, but it had 10 horns. And it says, "which had eyes and mouth uttering great boasts, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. And I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the Highest One, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom." I want to point out here that God says there are only going to be 4 great Gentile kingdoms from that time until the second coming of Christ. The 4th kingdom, however, has a final phase. It rises as a great kingdom, but then we'll see in a moment that the 10 horns represent the final phase of this kingdom. And I'll point that out in a minute. But as Daniel said in Daniel chapter 2, he said these 4 kingdoms would have authority over the whole earth. Now, we've seen them come and go. We saw the Babylonian Empire was a great, mighty empire. The city of Babylon was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Medo-Persian Empire became an even more powerful kingdom and took over Babylon. In fact, it took over in one night the city of Babylon, which they said was invincible. What they did was they diverted the Euphrates River that ran through the center of the city of Babylon. They diverted it and dammed it up as the sun was going down, and the water stopped. And there were great bronze gates that went down into the water, where the water went through the city, 2 of them, one on each end. And they didn't notice that the water receded. And while this was receding into the night, there was a great party that the king of Babylon was throwing, and he brought out some of the stolen implements they had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and they were drinking toast to all of their gods with them. And suddenly a hand appeared and wrote on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. That meant weighed in the balance, found wanting, divided. And when Daniel was called in to interpret it for the king, he says, your kingdom has been weighed in God's judgment, and it is divided. Tonight it will fall, and you will not see morning. And it was just after that the water stopped, and the great mighty armies of the Medes and the Persians marched under the bronze gates where the riverbed was into the city, and the city fell in one night. That despite the fact that they had walls around that city that were over 300 feet high, and so broad at the top that 5 chariots could be driven around the whole city on the top of the wall. So what God predicted happened. And then the Medes and the Persians took over, and they were extended until the rise of a young Greek. It was actually a Macedonian upstart. He was one of the Greek tribes, named Alexander the Great, arose. And you know, Daniel chapter 8 predicted very carefully what that would be. In Daniel chapter 8, it's amazing. He said, and he's explaining some symbols that were at the beginning of this chapter. Again, the interpreting angel. And it says, and behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. The ram which you saw with 2 horns represents the kings of Medo-Persia. Now, when Daniel got this vision, the Medes and the Persians had just taken over Babylon. And he says, and the shaggy goat you saw represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. The Medes and the Persians had just taken over Babylon. But Daniel was able to, by this vision, predict that the Greeks would conquer the mighty Medo-Persian Empire. And it would be when the first king of all Greece would rise and come and conquer them. He says, the shaggy goat that you saw represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, then he says, and the broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represents 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. Now, going back into history again, Alexander, he crossed the Hellespont, which means the pont. It's the bridge, means the Greek bridge. It's a narrow part of the Dardanelles, a thin body of water that goes between Asia and Europe, between Greece and what is now Turkey. He took his army and crossed the narrow bridge there, went into Troy, and there were a number of Greeks that were colonized along the Mediterranean side of that of Asia Minor, as it was called then. And he got everybody to go with him because he said the Greeks were being mistreated by the Persians, and everybody bought that. And he went there, but no one really wanted to take on the several million-man Persian army, which was noted as one of the most powerful armies in history. So Alexander got them over there, but he kept going further and further south down the coastline. And he got them to the point where if he provoked Persia, they'd have no means of retreat. They'd have to fight. And that's what he wanted. He wanted to fight them. And he said, we're going to beat them. And so outnumbered about 20-1, the Persians finally took the bait. They came over, and he first joined battle with them in a carefully planned battlefield. He picked the battleground where his lesser numbers would not be overruled by the superior numbers of the Persians. It was a narrow valley with a narrow entrance. It was near a place called Issus and Arbela. And there Alexander joined the fight with them. And to everyone's amazement, through this new battle formation he called the phalanx, they beat the best, what were called the immortals, the elite troops of the Persian army. They beat them, not just a little bit, but they just absolutely steamrolled them. And that caused the rest of the army to panic, and there was a great slaughter. And the King Darius fled and was killed by one of his own people. Now, no one thought that this little upstart from Macedonia could beat the mighty Persian Empire. It had ruled for 200 years. It was a tremendous, rich power. But God predicted it, and it happened. And then Alexander took his army over several years all the way to India, conquering everything in between. What is now Afghanistan he conquered. As a matter of fact, there are artifacts there that remain from his time. And finally, he gets to the end, and his soldiers were weary of war and weary of conquest. They had not seen home in years. So they finally persuaded him to turn back. And he goes back in one of the cities of Persia. He drank himself to death. I think it was out of boredom of not having anything to conquer. But he died at age 33, having conquered the known world. Now, that was at the height of his glory. Now, what did the prophecy say? In Daniel chapter 8, it says, the broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represents 4 kingdoms, which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And there's something else said about this. It's important in the first part of Daniel 8. It says in verse 8, then the male goat, that's Greece and Alexander, magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. When he became mighty, when he became victor, He was broken off. He was killed. He wasn't killed. He died. He died of, some say that he died of some fevers that he picked up on his long trek into India and so forth, but I'm sure he weakened it by much drinking. And just as it was prophesied by Daniel, he died at the height of his power. And then, now this is important, then the four horns, which it says in the interpretation in the latter part of Daniel 8, it says the four kings that rose with him would take over and split his empire and take it over, but not with the power he had. He had four field marshals, Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Exactly as predicted, they took it over. And it was interesting that Alexander had a son that was in the army with him. And so when he was about to die, all of the powerful generals gathered around him, and they said, "To whom do you will your kingdom?" That was just a ritual because they assumed he would say, "My son." But he didn't. With his last breath, he said, "Give it to the strong." After that, there was the two most powerful divisions of the Greek kingdom became Ptolemy and Seleucus. Ptolemy took over Egypt and the areas around there. Seleucus took over what would be Turkey, Syria, today's Iran, and things like that. And the others, they took over and divided what was the Greek mainland. So, but the two that was most powerful were Seleucus and Ptolemy. And they continued battling back and forth. And the important thing of that is they kept going along the only trade route that existed at that time, that went along mostly along the ocean until they come to Israel. And then they had to cut through and go through a pass into a great valley called Jezreel. And there was a great fortress that the Israelites built there on a place on the hill overlooking that valley called Megiddo. And it was there because with the narrow pass, they could control the armies that went back and forth. That is, unless they were too mighty for them to contain. Well, between Ptolemy and Seleucus and other conquerors over the times, they would go through there. They would get into a big fight at Megiddo. There'd be a war there, and Megiddo would be conquered and destroyed. Then they would rebuild it 21 times. There was a war of great power shifting back and forth basically between Ptolemy and Seleucus, and they would rebuild it. So that place became associated with the name of ultimate war, Megiddo. And the word in Hebrew for mountain is Har Megiddo, or it's been anglicized to mean Armageddon. Now, you know what that is. That's the ultimate war. And so this continued until the Romans came alive and then began to spread. And by 68 BC, they conquered everything, plus all that they had conquered in the West. They joined with conquering everything that Alexander's empire had. And so the mighty Romans took over and became the fourth great power. And they actually lasted longer than any empire in history. Any world empire, they lasted a minimum of 800 years as great power. And they continued 1,500 years if you count the fact that one part of the Roman Empire continued until Constantinople was taken over by the Muslims. And so that would have been 1,500 years that it lasted, at least a remnant of it. But is that the end of it? The focus of Daniel chapter 7 becomes that fourth kingdom, which is Rome. So he says, I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints, which means believers, and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints, the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Now he goes to interpretation. The interpreting angel talking to Daniel, giving him this revelation. He says in verse 23, thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms. And it will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. So that was the Roman Empire phase one. It crushed all of those that stood before it. You cannot go around the Mediterranean up into Europe, into even the northern climes, all over the Middle East, Asia Minor, which is Turkey, into England, even Hadrian's Wall that divides England from Scotland. Those are all testimonies to the greatness and the extended power of Rome. And yet, they disintegrated. And it's important to realize that as Babylon was conquered by mighty military power, Media-Persia was conquered by the mighty military might of Alexander. The Greek Empire, the remnants of it, was conquered by Rome. But no one ever conquered Rome. It just kind of disintegrated from within through the disintegration of character. And the scripture indicates that that would happen because it shows there's no power that conquers it. And then we go to verse 24 in Daniel chapter 7. Now this is a critical point to understand. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them. He will be different from the previous ones and will subdue 3 kings. All right, this is a critical verse. Now, Rome phase 1 lasted until around 376 AD, the main part of the Roman Empire, with Rome. That fell from within, and the Vandals just kind of took it over, but they didn't conquer it. The Romans just disintegrated, and they walked in. And yet, Roman power continued in spiritual form. And through the Roman Catholic Church, Rome still ruled over the kings of England almost up until modern times. Now, the important thing is, though, it says in verse 24, as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom. And the important thing is the preposition out of. In other words, out of the Roman Empire phase 1, the one that disintegrated. In the last days, just before Christ returns, because verse 24 doesn't refer to history, it refers to the future. Because what comes out of this ancient kingdom rises again, and it is the power that is over the world when the antichrist rises out of it, and it is destroyed this time by the second coming of Christ. So, how are we to interpret this? Well, there has to be a colossal parenthesis in history between verse 23 and verse 24. The Roman Empire phase 1, it was gone as far as a political military power in 376 AD. The culture continued. There was a spiritual force that was part of the old Roman Empire that continued. But as a political, military power, it ceased to exist. However, it says there are 10 horns that represent a power that would rise in the days just before the return of Christ. And they would be out of Roman Empire phase 1. So verse 24 leaps over a big period of history and predicts that out of the former kingdom would arise 10 kings who will join together, and then there will be another king that will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. 3 kings from within the 10. Apparently, there would be 7 that would go along with him to unite into a revived Roman Empire in its final great form. But there would be 3 that would object, and he would just overthrow them. But it is this 11th king that is the Antichrist. And from where does he rise? Out of the old culture and people. Now, I believe that this person's alive right now. He's somewhere in Europe. Now, there's some who believe, well, the Muslims are so powerful right now that it's got to be a Muslim that's going to come and rise out of this kingdom, and he's going to be the one that becomes the Antichrist. Well, there's some who believe that, and they're good men. They're good Christian men, and I respect them. But I don't believe that's true. This is overlooking the fact that Scripture, prophecy indicates that within this world power that would be ruled by the Antichrist through these 10 nations that confederate together to form the basis of rule for the world, one world government, within that there would be 3 more discernible powers. And one is outlined in both Ezekiel chapter 38, 39, says that this power would come from the extreme north. And that means the extreme north of Israel. It tells us when this would happen. It happens in the last days when the Israelites are brought back from a worldwide dispersion and made a nation again. And since 1948, that's us. And so it would be at that time that a power to their extreme north would rise and ultimately become their formidable enemy. He will lead a great force confederated with people that Persia will bring in. It says Persia will gather together a force, and you look at all those tribal names that are the peoples today in various nations, and they are Muslims today. So there would be a force that would confederate under Persia or Iran's control and join with this power from the extreme north. Now, 3 times it says that this power would come from the extreme north. These who believe that the king of the north is still basically a Muslim power need to look at that word, because it means extreme north, not the southern borders of Russia that were part of the old Soviet Union. And it even names their forefathers, which were part of the ancient peoples that were feared far and wide. Magog, Meshach, and Tubal became basically known as the mighty tribes of the Scythians. And the Scythians became the primary progenitors of the modern Russian people. So you take the time factors today, you take the geological clue that's given us, extreme north, not just halfway, but a people known for being the kings of the extreme north. There's no other power to the extreme north of Israel but Russia. They will lead and arm the powers that join with them, particularly those that confederate under the control of Iran. And they will become part of this king of the north from the extreme north force that's going to come against Israel in the last days. I'm going to turn to Daniel chapter 11, where Daniel predicts, after he reveals in verses 36 of chapter 11 through 39, he reveals the false prophet who is one of the two antichrists predicted in Revelation chapter 13. He's the one called the false prophet. And he has all the power of the first antichrist, who's called the beast in Revelation 13, verses 1 through 10. And it talks about this one, and I believe that the false prophet here is talking about an Israelite. I believe one that will come from the tribe of Daniel, because Daniel is left out of the 12 tribes that are revealed in Revelation chapter 7, that are going to be 144,000 evangelists of the 7-year tribulation period. But it says, and I'll just quickly read it, verse 36, "Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. He will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. And he will show no regard for the God of his father." That's translated here, gods, and that's lamentable, because the original word is Elohim. Now, Elohim is plural, but that's the basic word for the God of the Bible. Elohim means the God of Israel. He is plural in personality, but one in essence. And so when it uses the word Elohim, it means not gods, but God, the God of Israel. And so it says here, he will pay no attention to the God of his fathers. Well, in the Bible, that's a direct reference to the God of Israel. The God of his fathers would be the God of Israel. And he calls him Elohim. And so there's no other religion that could point to this and say the God of his fathers. Only an Israelite could do that. And so it goes in and it says, "And he will show no regard for the God of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other God, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead, he will honor a God, literally, a God of forces." It's translated fortresses, but the better word is forces. "A God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. And he will take action against the strongest forces, literally, with the help," and here again, the best Hebrew word translation here is alien, "with the help of an alien God." I believe that is referring to Satan himself, because he's going to possess both of these antichrists. "With the help of an alien God," the God of this world, as he's called in the New Testament, "he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and he will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out the land for a price." This is part of the buildup of the final phase of Roman revived power, the final phase of Gentile power. And I want you to notice something, that in this prophecy about the 4 successive world powers, as far as God is concerned, they had authority over the whole world. That first it was in the Middle East. It was in Asia Minor. It was in first Babylon. Then the Medes and the Persians. But from that point on, it kept moving westward, because Persia was taken over by the Greeks. They were to the west. Then Greece was taken over by the Romans. They were further to the west. And so that's instructive, because it shows, what collection of cultures has had the dominance in the world that we know, since the time of Christ, since the Romans. It has been the West, and the great inventions of war and so forth have all basically been in the West. The conquerors have all come basically from the West. And so this is the capstone of them right here. And so once this man is described, there's another great leap in history from the time, from verse 35, where there had been a succession of predictions about history that's long past. These prophecies even predict the coming of Cleopatra. It talks about her and her effect on the Roman Empire. But then when we come to verse 35, it says, "And some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the time of the end, because it is still to come at the appointed time." Now, that's the end of that successive part of prophecy. And beginning with verse 36, there's a great leap over time again, a great parenthesis in time, and it picks up with the arising of the antichrist, the false prophet, and then it shows where this man will lead the world in verse 40. "And at the time of the end, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and horsemen and with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through." When it says at the time of the end, the king of the south will collide with him. All right, when there is a personal preposition that is used of a person, you have to go back in context to find out to whom this personal pronoun applies. And syntactically, that means it's the last person that was explained, or the last person that was identified. And the last person that was identified was the Antichrist, the false prophet. And so when it says at the time of the end, the king of the south will collide with him, it's talking about the false prophet who will be in Jerusalem. And it says, "And the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships, and will enter in countries and overflow them." So the king of the south joined with the king of the north to attack the false prophet. Why? Because as Jesus identified this time plot in Matthew 24, verse 15, he says, "And when you see the abomination of desolation take his place in the holy place, setting up in the holy place, then let he is on the rooftop not even go down to get his cloak, but flee to the mountains, because then shall come a tribulation that's never been seen since the beginning of mankind." Now, in other words, the moment this person, the Antichrist, takes his seat in the Jewish temple and takes his seat in the Holy of Holies, which is the abomination of desolation, and then proclaims himself to be God, and that's the ultimate blasphemy, that's when this loose alignment of world powers split, and they attack. They attack right away the Antichrist and Jerusalem to free it. And they're joined. The king of the north, Russia, leads the confederacy of Muslim nations that are with Iran in to take over and free that. Who is the king of the south? Well, it's interesting that if I were to name this, I couldn't have come up with something better. He's the king of the 1040 lateral. Did you know that Muslim power is all based in the northern latitudes of 10 degrees to 40 degrees? The dominant base of all of Muslim people is between the 10th and 40th latitude, that extends from Atlantic, where they have the Mauritanian, the Muslims control Mauritania, and it extends all the way over to the west of Indonesia, out in the Pacific, all along that 1040 lateral. And of course, the center of it is to the south of Israel, which is our prophetic base always, and that is Saudi Arabia, the center of their kingdom, which is Mecca and Medina. Now, that's the identity of this power, a sphere of power that will come with the king of the north. Verse 41, he will also enter the beautiful land, that's Israel, and many countries will fall, that is, those that are about Israel and those who support Israel. And he says, but these will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. All of these tribes, which were forefathers of vast peoples that came out of them, all of them are Muslim today. And the mountains of Edom and Moab are to the east of Israel and extend down along the tip of the Red Sea that comes up to it's called the Gulf of Aqaba or the Gulf of Eilat today. And it's on the eastern side. And the sons of Ammon, well, we know who they are. The capital of Jordan is Ammon. That's because of the tribal name that was the forefather of most of those people. So, why are they spared? Well, interestingly enough, the one natural fortress where God could quickly herd believers from Israel and the surrounding places, those who had believed in Jesus as Messiah, the one place that he could protect them, geographically speaking, is a place called Petra, which is right in the center of the mountains of Edom and the mountains of Moab. It is a natural fortress. I've been in there. You have to go over a mile through a narrow canyon that goes up as high as you, when you're riding a horse in there, as high as you can see it, weaves back and forth, and no army could easily come in there and take it. So Jesus said to flee to the mountains in Matthew 24 when they saw the abomination of desolation. I believe they know that they're to flee to that place that he'll protect them in the fortress of Petra. And I believe that's why he spares those people, because he's going to, another scripture says, when this army comes into that area, that the earth is going to open its mouth and swallow them up. Well, he's going to cause a great earthquake to swallow the army that's kind of trying to go to Petra and kill them. That's his protection. When the king of the south goes in there, they're going to, with the king of the north, they're going to sweep through, and it says, then he will stretch out his hand. Now, remember, in verse 41, it says, he will also enter the beautiful land. There's another one of those pronouns that has to be identified by the context. The last power to be identified before he, in verse 41, is the king of the north. So it's talking about the king of the north will enter Israel, with many countries it will fall under his foot. And then verse 42, it's still he, the king of the north, will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. You see, apparently not all Muslim nations are going to put themselves under the command of the Persians or the Iranians. There'll still be some independent powers within Islam that won't be part of that. And they will not come riding in there and swarming all over Israel and through that part. And Egypt will probably be the power that takes charge over the black African and the northern African peoples called Cush and Put, progenitors of races there. Cush is the progenitor of all black Africans. Put is the forefather of the peoples along the northern Mediterranean that are known as Libyans. They are the Algerians, Moroccans, Mauritanians, and they're all descendants of Put. So apparently, Ezekiel chapter 38 indicates that they will be a separate power that will be fighting. They come to Egypt, and they take over, and it says he will gain control over all the hidden treasures of gold and silver and all over all the precious things of Egypt. And Libyans and Ethiopia, the original word is what I was talking about. Put is the word translated Libyans. But Put was a forefather of many more peoples than Libya. It was all that I explained about the northern part. Ethiopia is the translation of Cush. Cush was the father of all black Africans, not just Ethiopians. Apparently they will be under siege by this northern confederacy with Iran. But in verse 44 it says, but rumors, or actually battle intelligence would be a better word, but battle intelligence from the east and from the north will disturb him, that is the king of the north, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate the many, meaning Israel. And he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion, that means his command headquarters, between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. All right, now here's the point. Here's where those other spheres of power come in. He receives intelligence from the east that troubles him, and intelligence from the north that trouble him. Well, where is the king of the north's power right then? Where is his leadership? Where is his commander? He's in Egypt. So if you look to the east of Egypt, you're looking toward Asia. And if you look to the north of Egypt, you're looking at Rome and the revived Roman Empire. So I'd be troubled too, because it is the antichrist of Rome, the first beast of Revelation 13, 1 through 10, the one who comes out of the whore of Babylon, the city that's called the whore of Babylon, the city of the seven mountains, and so forth. All of this figures in that the king or the antichrist, who will be the world leader, will apparently muster the troops of the west and be coming in to cut off the king of the north and the king of the south's supply lines. And so he quickly retraces his steps back to Israel, and he sets up his command headquarters in order to fight the last war of the world in Jerusalem. Because when he says it would be between the two seas on the beautiful holy mountain, well, that's the sea of the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and in the center is the Temple Mount. And that's where he'll set up his headquarters. From there, there will be the final part of the War of Armageddon. You see, I'd be troubled too if I got battle intelligence from the east while I'm exposed with a long supply line down in Egypt. Because Revelation chapter 9, and is mentioned again in verse 16, talks of a power that comes from the east of the Euphrates. And in ancient times, everything east of the Euphrates was Asia. And they're called the kings of the east in Revelation 16:12. It says an army of 200 million Asian soldiers are going to come into the Holy Land and fight. They cross the Euphrates miraculously and race into battle. And that's another sphere of power, and a power that can field 200 million soldiers. At the time the book of Revelation was written, there weren't 200 million people in the world. Yet he said there'd be 200 million soldiers. Well, listen, China alone could field an army of 200 million people and still have a few million left to defend the homeland. And you join them with another power that's rising, India. You've got about 2.6 billion people right there. So they'll move into this. Apparently, they're going to protect their interest in world commerce and so forth. They're not going to let any one power take over the oil fields and other wealth that's there. So they come in as a separate force to fight, and they will destroy a great many people. And then the Antichrist has signed a covenant with Israel. That started the last 7 years of history before Christ returns. He has to come in because he has sworn to protect Israel. And so you have the last war will be fought as the Muslim Confederacy under Iran, joined with Russia, they will be fighting from a fixed position in Israel and strewn along that seaboard there. And then will come a coalition of Western forces under the Antichrist. He will come in and fight them from the north. And then will come, at the same time, this tremendous army, 200 million soldiers from Asia into the army. And that's the time when blood will flow to the horse's bridle. And you know where that'll be? It says it's something over 200 miles. There's only one valley in all that region that long, and that's the one that extends from the foot of Mount Hermon, where the Jordan River Valley starts, all the way down southward to the Sea of Galilee, down to the Dead Sea, and from the Dead Sea all the way down to the Gulf of Eilat, which is the eastern tip of the Red Sea. Now, it says blood will flow to the horse's bridle there, and you can see why. When you've got those kinds of armies fighting, 4 spheres of power locked together. And that's why the War of Armageddon is going to be the worst, the most devastating, the most terrible that the world will ever see and never will see again. Even at the end of the kingdom that'll last 1,000 years after Jesus returns and judges the survivors, the believers go into that kingdom as mortals, the unbelievers are cast directly into judgment. Even after Jesus rules for 1,000 years, when there's a rebellion against his rule, there's not going to be a war. They gather for war, but he judges them before there can be another war. And so the war to end all wars, as far as between mankind, it will be the War of Armageddon. And I've gone into these things because I think it's important to realize, and there are many more things that I could bring up that shows there has to be 4 spheres of power. And even though there's going to be a one world government, all of them will join in. That will be broken when the Antichrist and the false prophet declare that he is God, and that he does the abomination of desolation. You know, folks, I can't be more serious when I say all of these things are set up before our very eyes. I learned about these things 50 years ago and studying forward. I didn't take them as handed. I challenged them. I've considered every theory and so forth. But there's been a strain of careful interpreters down through history that I could trace back 400 years that have seen what I'm talking about here. And even though some were 300 years ago, they had some clear indications of these 4 spheres of power. They even talked about how could poor Russia be the king of the north and so forth. Bishop Loth in the 1700s was talking about that. And he talked about the fact that China would have to become a great power and would become the basic leader of that 200 million man's army that would come in there. So the discernment of these 4 spheres of political power headed by the Antichrist in the last days, it's discernible and it's important, and we see it now. I remember back in 1970s, I was declared a heretic by a cardinal from the Vatican. After he read The Late Great Planet Earth, he said, I knew he was a heretic, but this proves it. Lindsey says there's going to be a united Europe. There'll be the United States of Europe. He said, that's impossible. Look how many have tried. No one's ever succeeded. And yet, look now. There is a United States of Europe. And the most amazing thing is that the original founders of the European Union is just 10 nations. And they are the ones that are they are considered the full members, and others have joined them have been called associate members. But this Western military alliance of the original 10 are the full members and the real power. And they exist right now. Look at how fast the world is being herded into a one-world government. And it's being done primarily by economics. The United States, back in 2001, was the mightiest military power, mightiest nation on earth. We were called the single world power. No one would call us that now. And we are, our present administration is throwing away our power with both hands. It's as if you can't get rid of our authority and power quick enough. And the economic Armageddon that we're watching with our eyes is destroying our economy. So I believe the time for Christ's return is very, very near. This is just part of some of the many, many signs that are being fulfilled right before our eyes. But this is a centerpiece. This is like laying the keel of the whole format of history that prophecy predicted would come together before the last 7 years of history begins. And remember, you and I as believers in Jesus Christ ain't going to be here. We leave before that 7 years can start. So think about this. Make sure that you've accepted the gift of power and the gift of eternal life through believing in Jesus Christ. Believe that he died for you. He purchased a pardon for you. But a pardon is not a pardon until you accept it. Just confess that you're a sinner, that you can't live up to God's standards, never will be able to. The Scripture says, whosoever keeps the whole law yet offends in one point is guilty of them all. That's why Jesus fulfilled the law for you, paid the penalty for you breaking it, and purchased a pardon that is complete and brings you eternal forgiveness and a relationship with God. Make sure you have it. It's as simple as praying and just saying, I believe you, Lord. I've received the gift of pardon, and I accept eternal life.